1988. The focus of these drug task force operations is output, not outcome. I'm sure everyone watching has seen a press release where law enforcement parade quantities of drugs on the table, with maybe a canine or two in the release. This is the output. If these task force operations measured outcomes, we would see that no matter how many drugs they put on the table for display, it will never cure one person of drug addiction. Outcomes can only be measured by the lives of impacted people. While you're listening to this testimony, think of the lasting effect drug operations are having on our community.
President here. In October of 1995, I experienced something that taught me trauma is like a black Sharpie on the whiteboard of our unconscious psyche. There is no erasure of the market leaves, just as there is no erasure of what I recall from a day that fall in 1995. I lived in our mobile home with my husband, our 2-year-old son, on my parents' land in the country. I was 7 months pregnant, visibly so. My son and I were in my parents' home. My mother was using the restroom, my father was outside, and my husband was at home next door. The next thing I know, I heard shouting from outside. I saw people dressed all in black, men, coming up the hill from every direction, throughout all the windows. As they were coming up the hill, there was a chorus coming from them. They were all yelling and shouting, "Don't move, put your hands up, keep them up," as they burst through all 3 doors. One of them stopped at me. Never taking his hand off the gun, he started asking me questions as my little boy began to cry next to me on the floor. I don't remember what all of those questions were. I just remember that my son was distressed and that I asked if I could pick him up. I was told no, keep my hands up. I had to override what my body instinctively wanted to do, the fight or flight reflex. I wanted to scoop my child up. I wanted to run, or I wanted to fight. But my mind knew that at any time, any of us could be shot and we could die. So I stayed still as my son wept for comfort on the floor next to me. One gun stayed on us as the rest began a flurry of activity around me and throughout the house and outside the property. I saw them in my peripheral as I tried to help my son cope. I told him, "Stay here by Mommy, Logan. It's okay. We're okay. We just need to stay here until this man says we can go home." I noticed 2 guns behind me shouting at my mom to come out of the restroom. "Now, don't flush. Do not flush. Come out now. We're coming in." I heard my mom crying, pleading that she couldn't do what they wanted her to do. She needed help. I told the gun trained on me. I said, "Sir, she can't come out alone. She needs me to help her get off the toilet. She's disabled. She can't walk. She needs me to pull her pants up. She's in a wheelchair." His gun relayed to the guns behind me at my mom what the predicament was. And they finally decided that I could help her, all the while shouting at her and then me as well. More commands of "Do not flush. Hurry up. Come out now. Do not flush." As I brought my mom out, one gun stayed on her as the other searched the bathroom. I couldn't tell you what any of those task force members looked like that day, any more than I can tell you what they asked me. I can't tell you any of their names. I can only recall that they all kept their guns aimed or their hands still on them if they were holstered at all. The guns commanded my attention because I knew they were the biggest threat to my children's safety, both on the floor and in my womb. Those men became synonymous to the guns they led with, dressed all in black, loud, caustic, emotionless, and unpredictable, all streamlined to their fingers on triggers trained on each of us. When I brought my mom out of the bathroom, I stopped her next to my son, who was also crying for his Nana now. As I was locking the wheels, he did what he would normally do when upset. He tried to climb up into her lap, but the gun trained on her shoved my sweet boy to the floor. He then fell and began crying louder. This was my son just before the event. This is who they treated like a threat. This is who the gun that shoved him shouted at him afterwards, quiet, stay down, like he was a threat, like he knew anything of what they were doing, like he was supposed to ignore his pain from falling and a fear of what was happening. My 2-year-old innocent child. I turned to the gun next to me, the one that was trained on me, and I said, please, can you just get his father at least? Can you search him? Can you do something? Can you let him hold him? My son doesn't understand. He's scared. There's no way for him to understand this. He shouldn't even be here. I asked, can't one of us take him home? The gun stated we had to wait to go home until they could search with us there. It was dark out by the time my husband was finally produced to hold him. My mother was taken away in an ambulance, my father in handcuffs, in front of their grandson. 2 guns then escorted my husband and I and my son home. Their search and questions of our property lasted less than a minute. And as soon as they left, I ran to the kitchen sink to vomit, holding my hands on my belly. Holding my hands on this child, who was going to meet the world in two months. She was moving vigorously, and she wasn't safe in utero from the level of stress I felt from the ordeal I had experienced, or from having to stand that entire time, most of it with my hands up. Cortisol affects both mothers and their unborn babies. My husband spent that time trying to comfort our son. That same son, who was at my feet the night of the raid, is now 26. 5 years ago, he moved to Eau Claire with me to go to school. Shortly after this move, I took notice of all the different police cars in the city while driving one day, because my son, in the passenger seat, was pointing them all out. That day, one stopped alongside us at a light. I saw that my son seemed worried. He was acting how I'd seen other people who had drugs on them later in my life act, scared, like they were going to get pulled over. But my son has never been in trouble. My son never even tried alcohol until he was 21 because that was the legal drinking age. I knew that my son should legally have nothing to fear in that moment, so I tried to reassure him. I told him, I'm not speeding. We're not doing anything wrong. I'm not doing anything wrong. You're not doing anything wrong. We have insurance. There's nothing to be upset about. Why do you always point out the police when we go somewhere? He just shrugged. My grown man, adult son. His head hung down, his shoulders slumped. And he just replied, I don't know, Mom. It just makes me so nervous. So I looked beyond him to the officer in the car alongside us. In the time it took for the light to turn from red to green, it all came back to me. I saw the uniform. I remembered it all, especially all the guns. In that time, I was flooded with the memories, all of the memories of my experience and his experience with the West Central Drug Task Force. I remember, and then I want
All right. First, I'd like to thank Tammy for showing the courage to share her story like that. It's a very difficult thing to do. Also, I would also like to emphasize that at this point, that the no-knock raid that was conducted, the no-knock raid conducted on her residence was conducted in pursuit of marijuana. I would also emphasize that marijuana operations provide a substantial amount of revenue for drug task force operations. This can be evidenced in the plea agreements proposed to defendants caught with marijuana and cash on their person. One of the stipulations the defendant must agree to if they want to accept a plea agreement and likely avoid significant time in jail or prison is that the West Central Drug Task Force keeps their money. According to the Eau Claire County government website, the West Central Drug Task Force is comprised of 6 counties. The Wisconsin State Patrol, the Department of Criminal Investigations, UW Eau Claire, and UW Stout. Sheriff Kramer has been involved with the West Central Drug Task Force since 1991 and has been the project director since 1996. On June 5th, Sheriff Kramer stated to Eau Claire's WQOW that a high-intensity drug trafficking area designation was placed on Eau Claire County due to high levels of narcotics being passed through the area along I-94, mostly brought from the Twin Cities and Chicago. The sheriff's statement is misleading. The whole truth is that the Eau Claire County Sheriff's Department, the Eau Claire County District Attorney's Office, and the Criminal Justice Collaborating Council applied for this designation. The name high-intensity drug trafficking area seems to indicate that Eau Claire County is dealing with a drug crisis at a disproportionate rate as compared to other counties in Wisconsin. This is not the case. Quoting everycrsreport.com, petitions to designate a county as part of a HIDA are evaluated independently, not in relation to other petitions or to other conditions in other counties already designated HIDA counties. The overall funding for the 29 HIDA designated areas each year throughout the United States since 2009 has remained relatively stable until 2018. The funding for HIDA operations increased 10.2%, the largest increase by far in 10 years. The North Central HIDA, which comprises HIDA designated areas in Minnesota and Wisconsin, will receive between $3.1 million and $14.6 million. These funds will be distributed to 6 categories. Law enforcement, intelligence, support, prevention, treatment, and management and coordination. The treatment can be crossed off the list. In 2006, the White House's Office of National Drug Control Policy prohibited HIDA funds from being used for the creation or expansion of treatment programs. Another graphic to represent the disbursement of taxpayer money from agencies under the Department of Justice. As you can see, law enforcement spending takes precedent by a drastic margin over all other categories. The Bureau of Justice Assistance grant spending in 2016, 51% allocated to law enforcement as compared to 1% dedicated to victim services. And you can see the distribution throughout everything in between. How does law enforcement propose engaging in more effective and less racist tactics if every year these same agencies apply for the same financial assistance, allocated to the same programs, composed of the same officers? Where we dedicate our resources shows where our values lie. We can exclaim otherwise, but money talks. At this point, I would reiterate, we have been here before in this country, and it is our criminal justice officials who rationalize away historical truths to preserve their occupations. This is a map of the federal Western District of Wisconsin in green and the Eastern District in white. As you can see, there's a pattern here. The star indicates headquarters for HIDTA operations in Wisconsin. To further emphasize, there is a pattern to the distribution of these HIDTA designations. HIDTA designations in Wisconsin follow the patterns of urban population density, African American composition of population in the designated county, and accessibility of the area from major traffic thoroughfares. Whether intended or not, these HIDTA operations target minority populations with surgical precision. There are 7 HIDTA designated counties in Wisconsin: Brown, Racine, Kenosha, Dane, Rock, Milwaukee, and Eau Claire. These 7 counties contain over 90% of the African American population in Wisconsin. If you are wondering the total number of counties in Wisconsin, the answer is 72. It is safe to say that which counties received this designation does not occur by accident. This is a comparison of spending on incarceration in Wisconsin versus spending on the University of Wisconsin system between the years of 2017 and 2019. We can exclaim to have certain values here in Wisconsin, but our track record of spending does not support these claims. This is the national spending on the war on drugs since 1971. We're in a period now where law enforcement uses drug statistics and the deaths of our loved ones as evidence that their war needs to continue. Yet drug overdose deaths involving heroin rose from 1,960 in 1999 to 15,469 in 2016. Each of these are one-year national figures. This amount of spending, accompanied by equal amounts of failure, could only be seen from our government. In the American marketplace, law enforcement agencies would have been bankrupt decades ago given these results. The Community-Oriented Policing Services and the Bureau of Justice Assistance are the 2 Department of Justice agencies bankrolling the HIDTA designations. I want everybody to remember those emblems. The current Eau Claire County law enforcement apparatus is not the only culprit in this ineffective use of public tax dollars to wage ineffective drug war campaigns on people who they describe as career criminals and drug dealers. Wisconsin began traveling down this course in 1988 with the establishment of 29 drug task force organizations spanning the entirety of the state. The local West Central Drug Task Force was one of these 29 organizations. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, also known as the 94 Crime Bill, ramped up these drug task force operations by allotting $8.7 billion for the construction of state prisons in states that implemented truth in sentencing legislation. The Wisconsin legislature and then Wisconsin Governor Tommy Thompson fell for this bait, and subsequently so did the Wisconsin public. Despite law enforcement and politicians' claims that the 94 Crime Bill reduced crime significantly, it in fact did not. In a report released by the Office of Government Accountability in 2005, the summary headline of this assessment reads, "Cops grants were a modest contributor to declines in crime in the 1990s." By cops, that's the community-oriented policing services, so the money awarded to different areas of the United States by them. The GAO report goes on to state that factors other than cops' funds accounted for the majority of the decline in crime during this period. For example, between 1993 and 2000, the overall crime rate declined by 26%, and the 1.3% decline due to cops. So it was only 1.3% of a decline that was attributed to cops funding. That amounted to about 5% of the overall 26%. So 21% came from something else. Similarly, cops contributed about 7% of the 32% decline in violent crime from 1993 to 2000. So once again, that 32% is not attributed to cops funding. 7% is attributed to cops funding. What this report also does not factor in is the events that have transpired because of the funding of a war on Black and brown communities. If we want to begin looking to root causes for violence within the Black community, look no farther than the policing practices that have been imposed on African American communities since 1971. I want you to take notice that the same agencies funding the high-intensity drug trafficking area designation awarded to Eau Claire County in June of 2020 are the same agencies that have been funding the war on drugs for decades. This is not coincidental. In June of 1988, the Wisconsin legislature acted 1997 Wisconsin Act 283. This was the initial truth in sentencing legislation in Wisconsin. With Act 283, we saw the collapse of the parole system and the implementation of mandatory extended supervision sentences to accompany incarceration. Wisconsin's truth in sentencing legislation requires people charged with violent and nonviolent crimes alike to serve 100% of their sentences. This sentencing structure takes away incentives for rehabilitation and focuses primarily on punitive measures to address crime in Wisconsin. Even when an individual is released from prison, the threat of prison only remains one rule violation away in the form of crimeless revocation, a concept we will discuss here shortly, and I want you to remember that term, crimeless revocation. Now let's get into the mud on this. Former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker served 9 years in Wisconsin legislature between 1993 and 2002, prior to holding the position as Wisconsin's 45th governor from 2011 to 2019. Walker took a major role in drafting the 1997 truth in sentencing legislation enacted in 1998. And remember, there was an $8.7 billion incentive to states that enacted truth in sentencing legislation. That was under the 94 crime bill. By early 2000s, there were 20,000 prisoners in the Department of Corrections system built for 10,000. Walker's next push was to use private prisons to house excess prisoners, but Wisconsin law prohibits private prisons within the state. Acting on legislation from 1995 and 1997, the Wisconsin legislature authorized the Wisconsin Department of Corrections to begin shipping prisoners to private prisons out of state. This was their loophole. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, Wisconsin shipped approximately 5,000 prisoners to Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Minnesota at a taxpayer price tag of $45 million. Most of this taxpayer money went to a sole private prison company, the Corrections Corporation of America. From 2005 to 2015, the Corrections Corporation of America spent $45 million on political contributions and lobbyists nationally and in Wisconsin. Corrections Corporation of America representatives contributed to Scott Walker's gubernatorial campaign, even though the Corrections Corporation of America is based out of Nashville, Tennessee, and has no facilities in Wisconsin. I want to emphasize at this point that it was Democratic-led legislation that began this snowball effect of ramping up the mass incarceration of Black and brown people. Republicans chose to further these racist policies in Wisconsin. So I make that point to say that no matter which side of the aisle a politician stands on, I, as a Black man, have a very hard time trusting them until I've seen them put to action what they say they stand for, no matter what their political affiliation is. These are the prisons that we opened up since 2000. So this was after we started pulling people back in from out-of-state prisons. Stanley Correctional, which is very close to Eau Claire, only about 30 minutes away. New Lisbon Correctional, Milwaukee Secure Detention Center, and Red Granite Correctional. At the beginning of 2020, this is where the prison population stood. Currently, our prison system is at more than 130% capacity. We have two choices: reform how we deal with poverty, addiction, and militarized policing, or build more prisons. The recent HITA designation in Eau Claire County implies that law enforcement infrastructure in this county wishes to double down on the latter option. Once again, we have been here before in this country, and it is our criminal justice officials who rationalize away historical truths to preserve their occupations. In 2000, over 46% of the Wisconsin prison population was comprised of African Americans, even though African Americans only make up 5.7% of the Wisconsin population in that year. In 2016, African Americans comprised 42.9% of the prison population and only 6.7% of the community population. In Eau Claire County, and now this is from this year and right now, in Eau Claire County, African Americans make up 1.2% of the community population and 20% of the jail population. For those who think structural racism is not present in this county, think again. The problem here is at the county level, law enforcement administrators are not willing to have an open conversation about this. And I want to emphasize, I'm talking county level right now. So crimeless revocation is an issue that goes along with truth in sentencing. When we say long sentences, you have to complete the entirety of your sentence. Say you get 5 years in prison, you may get another 5-year extended supervision term. You have to complete that 5-year extended supervision term. And if you get revocated any time during that 5-year supervision term, you end up back in prison. So smart justice, this is another campaign that the ACLU of Wisconsin has that is very, very active throughout the entirety of Wisconsin. I am with the Rights for All campaign, which really we're trying to rally people to vote, but we work very much hand in hand with smart justice. Smart justice is focusing on crimeless revocations for multiple reasons. Here's some. Crimeless revocation and extended supervision, technical or rules-only violations, send individuals back to prison for violating a rule of supervision that does not involve committing a new crime. That's why it's called crimeless. These revocations for violations of supervision rules. These revocations for violations of supervision rules as minor as borrowing money, missing an appointment, or accepting employment without prior approval accounted for 45% of all admissions to Wisconsin prisons in 2017. I can throw another one in there. I bought a house and didn't get approval. It was fortunate that I had been on supervision successfully for so long that that wasn't something they could harass me for. But that is something that you can be thrown back in prison for. The number of crimeless revocations to prison increased by at least 25% between 2000 and 2017. During this time period, that represented the greatest increase of any admission type. Wisconsin's number of individuals on supervision is 5,000 more than those on supervision in Alaska, Maine, Montana, New Hampshire, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming combined. All right, so this is what I referred to in the beginning. I told you why it's important to vote. The first thing you need to do is get registered. You can do that at myvote.wy.gov. Then you need to get informed. You can do that at vote411.org. And then you just make sure you show up. Step 3 that we need you to do, engage your network of relationships. Make sure they're registered to vote and make sure they've ordered their absentee ballot. If they haven't ordered it already, get on them tonight to order it at myvote.wy.gov. Step 4, use social media to show your involvement. And step 5, contact one of these organizers that I have up on this next slide. And I would encourage everyone to take a picture or a screenshot of each of these slides. This next slide are organizers from this area. Whatever you are most interested in, they will cover one of these, they will cover that topic. But the big thing is that everybody gets involved. How does this voting relate to everything that I presented here today? Well, for instance, the Western District of Wisconsin State's Attorney and the Eastern District of Wisconsin State's Attorney, they are both nominated positions. They were nominated by the president. The head of the DEA, the acting head of the DEA right now, nominated by the president. At our county levels, the sheriff is an elected official. The head district attorney is an elected official. Your vote very much matters to any of these issues that I talked about today. And just to really cement that point, at the end of this, Wisconsin Conservation Voters of Kate Beaton is going to go through about a 5-minute demonstration on how to fill out your absentee ballot. It's very critical that you fill out your absentee ballot correctly so that your vote counts. Thank you everyone for listening. We're going to transfer over to Ann's portion of the presentation.
Hello, everybody. All right. Thanks, David, for all that information. Good stuff. I'm going to kind of go over a little bit of public education funding and how that all ties in. So I'm Ann Francis, and I'm one of the Northwest organizers for Wisconsin Public Education Network. And we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy coalition connecting all public education supporters to information, actions, and each other to be a strong collective voice for the excellent public schools that all of our kids deserve. And I'm going to share a little bit about myself, just so you all know how I got here. So this is when I was little. I've always been super serious, asked lots of questions, and wonder why things work the way they do and how everything's connected. So I grew up in rural Nebraska. The town I came from had less than 1,000 people. I had 2 brothers, one older, one younger, and both of my parents are retired public educators. I've worked in lots of fields and always noticed the inequities in all of those. And that's, and I also grew up with my dad who he came from a poor family. And I always remember him sharing this story about he'd get 1 pair of shoes and by the end of the year, he'd have to cut the toes out because his shoes were too small. And that no kid is more deserving than any other kid, and never make fun of anybody. And we all deserve the same things, and no child deserves to have less. So I'm passionate about public education advocacy for a lot of reasons, but this quote pretty much sums that up. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river, and we need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in the first place. And that's why I'm here today. I'm tired of having to pull people out of the river. I'm tired of watching public school teachers run along the side with tattered lifeboats, trying to save kids from drowning. So that's really why I'm here. I've been spending a lot of time in criminal justice, and that's how I met David. And so I decided to go upstream a little bit. And these are some of the reasons why kids fall into the river or are being pushed in. So we have cuts to investment in public education, expansion of police and prison budgets, lack of affordable housing, food deserts, income and wealth gaps, lack of safe and clean water. We have lots of lead in our pipes, and we have factory farms polluting water in Wisconsin. No access to affordable health care. That's a big problem in rural areas. Racist policies, and the lack of political will to change any of this. Poverty, childhood trauma, and we heard 2 stories from Tammy and David and how that affects all of this. Not enough counselors and nurses in our schools, and then no access to broadband and internet. And that's very important right now. What does it look like when we pull people out of the river? So I put hunger here, and this is, we volunteer at food banks, and that's super important. We have to get people out of the river, make sure they're okay, and then head upstream and figure out why they're in there. Homelessness, homeless shelters, kids falling asleep in school, kids coming to school hungry, increase in mental health crisis, overflowing prisons, addiction, and increases in depression and anxiety. So the answer to how does school funding work is, it's very complicated. And I'm just doing a very brief overview, and our network does offer a lot more detail. You can find stuff on our website, and we do offer classes sometime to go over more detail in public education. So here's an overview. I'm going to start with this graph, and this is because David talked, of course, we know all the segregation and how the criminal justice system affects Black and brown people so much more than white people, and our schools do the same thing. So you can see here in 1950, this is the segregation of our Milwaukee schools. And I'm talking about Milwaukee, but we know that this goes on all over our state. And then you can see in 1987, we get all the way down here, and then now we're all the way back up here. And I do want to point out a couple of things on this graph. The X axis here, it's not even. So this looks like a really big drop, but it was actually over a 15 to 20 year period. Okay, so in 1976, a federal judge ruled that Milwaukee schools were unconstitutionally segregated. And at that time, Chapter 220 program was started to fix that, and it was working. and that is the integration program. And then you can see, so you can see on the chart what's going on there. And then in 1990, the nation's first voucher program was implemented in Milwaukee. In 1993 and 94, and remember David mentioned that that's when the federal crime bill was enacted, so this coincides with that. In Wisconsin, we built a three-legged stool to fund our public schools. And the first leg was the, qualified economic offer law, and that limited teachers' raises and benefits to 3.8%. And the second thing was revenue limits, which we'll go over in more detail coming up. And the third leg was 2/3 funding commitment from the state. So the state promised to fund 2/3 of the cost of public education. In 1998, so this was, as David mentioned, this coincides with the truth in sentencing legislation. The Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled that the city of Milwaukee could use those vouchers to fund religious schools. And then also in 1998 was the advent of open enrollment. And one thing to know about open enrollment is the schools where a kid, if they try to enroll in another school, that school can deny them for things like truancy or for behavioral problems and things like that. In 2003, that is when we got rid of the 2/3 funding commitment. In 2009, that's when they cut the qualified economic offer law. So we're left with the revenue limit. So we have this very shaky one-legged stool to fund our public education system. And what is a revenue limit? So if you think about a pie, the crust is going to be the revenue limit, so that cannot change sizes. And so there's two fillings. You have state aid and local taxes. So when one goes up, the other one has to go down. And so that's why locally we have to increase our taxes to cover some of the expenses for public education. And there's also levy limits and limits on that. So that's why we go a lot to referenda, which is going to taxpayers and asking them, hey, we need some more money to fund our schools. And the majority of those pass in a bipartisan way. So people are very serious about paying for their public schools. And notice that that limit is, we're still using the same one today that we were using in 93, 94. And then in 2013, we're moving along on this chart. You can kind of see what's going on here. The private voucher program goes statewide. And then in 2015, the state legislature, at the urging of Governor Scott Walker, voted to end the Chapter 220 program, which was the integration program. So let's talk about a little bit about the cost of vouchers and what that, so the vouchers are going to private schools. Most of them are religious schools, and it gets peeled right out of the public school budget. So our public tax dollars are paying for our public school system, and then this money is just getting siphoned right out of there. So you can see how much it's gone up since 2017. So it's a pretty significant amount. And why is that important? Well, here's what ends up happening and why we have equity problems. So in public schools, the average is about $5,000 that a student gets. And that's average. So some schools get a lot more and some get no state aid. In the private schools and the vouchers you can see the inequity right there. Okay, so here's the list of things that a public school has to do. So this is what our tax dollars pay for. These are all good things. Financially and academically accountable to taxpayers and democratically elected school boards. They accept and educate all students. No matter their needs or abilities, they're welcome in our public schools. They're required to follow federal anti-discrimination laws. All educators must be certified and licensed. They educate a significant number of children with disabilities. They're held to a rigorous level of accountability. They're fully vetted public employees and volunteers, and they're required to provide bilingual education, and English as a second language instruction. And then here's the list for private schools. There is no list. They don't have to do any of that stuff. This is the general overall school aid as a percentage of the general fund. And there are some outliers, but in general, the funding has gone down for public education. And what do all these funding inequities lead to? It's all the stuff that David talked about, public education, a budget. The budgets are where we determine what is important. And we have 860,000 kids who are counting on us. And all these things that are popping up here are, we have disparities. And all that leads to this. So in Wisconsin, our English as language learner funding is pitiful. We have the worst special education funding in the nation. We have the 4th largest cuts to education in the country, the worst achievement gaps. Our mental health funding doesn't really exist, and we have the widest racial gaps in the nation. So that's obviously what we're doing isn't working. So this is a saying, sold down the river. And that's what they used to say when a slave misbehaved, they were sold down the river. And that's what we're doing to some of our kids. We're selling them down the river. They're failing, and it's not their fault. It's because of choices that legislators have made on what to fund and what they think is important. So what can we do? So all that stuff sounds so bad, but hey, if we all come together, we can show up. We have our Vote Public campaign for 2020. So we need to be supporting candidates who support public education. And you need to ask them stuff. You need to ask them, and people who are running for office again, ask them where they stood on policy. Look up and see what they voted for. See who supports their campaigns or who has supported them when they were in office. Stay informed by joining our email list at wisconsonnetwork.org. Follow us on Facebook, and you can find some current action steps on wisconsonnetwork.org/digital. And then we have our summer summit coming up on July 24th, and there's going to be some great speakers. Lots of stuff is about inequities in our school systems. And then one other thing I want to bring up that I think is super important is to just always question everything. So if there's a policy, ask why does this policy exist, and who created it, and who supports it, and most importantly, who does it benefit? And if it's not everyone, then it's a racist policy. So we need to be showing up and asking those questions and getting out and voting, because we are the leaders that we've been waiting for. Okay, with all that said, I'm going to hand this over to Kate, and she will help us with our absentee ballots.
All right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I assume you can. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go through, so we heard a lot about lots of reasons why we should be voting. There's a huge election coming up this November, as well as a primary coming up this August. And so I'm going to share my screen and go through how to fill out your absentee ballot. So here we go. All right, so here's my screen. First, I wanted to just point you to the myvote.wi.gov website. This is where you request your absentee ballot. This is the homepage. You click Vote Absentee, and then you would put in your name and your birth date. And then this is where you would be able to see if you're registered or not, which address you're registered at, and then also, I've already requested my absentee ballot, but the button here is what you would push to request your absentee ballot. It's super easy. It takes about 5 minutes. It's very comprehensive, and it's really easy you do have to upload your photo ID, but you can do that really easily, especially if you're requesting your absentee ballot on your phone, on your smartphone. So first I wanted to point you to some instructions. I understand that a lot of communities are sending, along with absentee ballots through the mail, they're sending voting instructions. As a regular voter and a voter rights advocate, I even have to read these instructions every time just to make sure that I'm doing it right. So please, as you're filling out your absentee ballot, do not skip this step, reading your instructions. This will include a lot of information that maybe you have known in the past, but need a quick refresher. So, there's a lot of information on this set of instructions, which is from the town of Brunswick. But I did want to point you to a couple of things on this instruction guide. The first is that, at least in the August election, this is a partisan primary election, and what you're going to be sent is a primary ballot. You can only vote in one party's primary at one time. You can choose to vote in one party in one election and another party in another election. You do not have to be a registered Democrat or registered Republican, but you can only vote in one party's primary at one time. So, so you'll be asked to, I'll switch my screen to the actual ballot, but you'll be asked to vote, you'll be asked to choose one party and then vote only in that party. I also wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the ballot that you'll receive in the mail has postage paid already. Your ballot should be ready to go. You just need to fill it out and put it in your mailbox. You shouldn't have to put a stamp on it. Okay, so next I wanted to show you what the actual ballot looks like. You'll see, for those of you who are voters, this should look fairly familiar. But again, I wanted to draw your attention to the party preference selection box. You can choose Democrat, Republican, or Constitution Party on the August ballot. And then after you were to choose one of those, you could only fill out the Democratic primary here, the Republican primary here, or the Constitution primary here. If you were to say vote for Ron Kind and Warren Petrick, a Democrat and a Republican, your ballot would not be counted. Neither of those marks would be counted, even though that these people aren't running against each other. So it's really important that you only vote in one party. You should use a black or blue pen to fill in the circle of the person's name that you're voting for. And fill in the circle completely. Now, once you're done filling out your ballot, you would put it in an envelope that will come with your ballot itself, inside of the envelope that it comes in. This is one side of the envelope. The yellow sections are the sections that you need to fill out. So you have you need to sign your ballot here and write the date of today's date. And then you do need a witness for filling out your ballot. So you need somebody to witness you filling out your ballot. They shouldn't really see who you're voting for, but they should see that you're doing it. So they would sign here, and they should add their address here on this yellow line as well. So again, all three of these sections need to be filled out. If they're not, your ballot won't be counted. Lastly, I wanted to draw your attention to the back side of your ballot. This is the opposite side as this view here. I just wanted to draw your attention to it because you don't need to do anything on this side, as far as I know. This side is all for office use, and so know that it's there, but you don't have to fill anything out here. So that's basically it. I did want to say, like I said, there are some specific things that you need to do or not do in order for your ballot to be counted. Some communities are really good about following up with people who have issues with their ballot. I know Eau Claire, the Eau Claire Clerk's Office, is calling people who might miss the address of their witness here or something else, so that people can have a chance to have their ballot counted. But this isn't a requirement, and it certainly might be something that would fall off if clerk's offices get really busy. So do the best you can to fill those out so that you can make sure your vote is counted. that's it for me. Thanks, all.
Thank you, Kate. All right, so Rye, we had a question.
We did. Shall I read it for you?
Sure.
Okay, in the Zoom Q&A, someone wrote, the disproportionate share of Black men in prison can be, and perhaps often is, construed as indication that Black men are more likely to commit crimes that qualify for incarceration than are white men. How can we respond to that claim?
Now, this is a very good question, and I have a very good example for this from my own lived experience, but then also this is something that is verifiable if the jails in some counties may, but Eau Claire County doesn't release this information because I inquired on it and I plan on going further in depth. So take, for instance, it's really about the severity of the charge during your first contact with a law enforcement officer. So if you get into, say, in the jail, if you're in jail for a misdemeanor and you're awaiting, can't pay your bond to get out, so you're awaiting court, and you get into a fight, two white guys that get into that fight, and you're only in there for a misdemeanor, or maybe you're in there for a felony, but it's a non-violent felony, like a drug felony or something, get into a fight, it's very less likely that those two white individuals are going to be charged with a battery by prisoner, which is a felony offense. Now take a Black individual that gets into a fight with either a Black individual or any other race, especially if this person has drug charges on him and has the West Central Drug Task Force and as applied to Eau Claire County, trying to build a case against them. Well, now they get into a fight. So one, you may have the bias of the individual, this corrections officer, who decides to push it up to the DA and see if they'll charge, and maybe they will charge with that felony. But then you also have the pressure coming from the drug task force who wants another felony charged on an individual, because that just gives them even more ammunition to use with whatever the original charges were. So it's really about the charging that they do at first contact. So say you're in a city like Milwaukee or any city, and you get charged with a felony and the officer decides to charge it as, and the DA decides to charge it as a violent crime. Well, you're tagged with that violent crime, even though it may not have been violent. It could have been a simple battery, or it could have been a simple fight. It could have been anything. And so there's too many chances when you come into contact with the criminal justice system and remain in the criminal justice system for any one of those exposures to put you at a level where now every time you get arrested, you're staying in jail and you're going to prison. Do we have any other questions that needed to be answered? Or is that the extent?
I think those are the only questions.
Okay, cool. I answered a lot of questions in the chat. I also left my email in there. So anybody that is interested in getting involved in the Rights for All campaign, go ahead and shoot me an email and I will respond to it. Once again, make sure you get registered to vote. I hope you took a screenshot of that page, get others registered to vote, and help them get informed on the issues. Look at the ACLU of Wisconsin's Facebook page, both Rights for All campaign and the Smart Justice campaign. These are two campaigns being launched in Wisconsin right now. We're in a moment of history where there is a movement that has started. There's been a movement, but the murder of George Floyd has really, really inspired a lot of people in white communities to start stepping up. So I encourage everybody to take this opportunity to get involved. And I'm one point of contact for that. And the other organizers are also that were on that slide. They're also points of contact for you to do that. So I thank everybody for coming out. We'll be having a Rights for All presentation once a month, every month. I will make sure that it's put out, the invitation is put out, and it will be concerning issues like this that relate to Eau Claire County and to Wisconsin. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Okay, just stop the live stream and